start anyway. Admirals, generals, ambassadors, and honored guests, I am Brigadier General Matt Brand, Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Plans and Policy at Allied Command Transformation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Paris and the NATO Transformation Seminar 2014. Bienvenue à Paris. Before we kick off this morning's events, I have just a few administrative announcements that will assist us all in the process of the seminar over the next day and a half. First of all, let me say it was a pleasure to meet some of you at the Icebreaker last night. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that I did. You are currently seated in the Salon Berlioz. This is the room we will use for all the plenary discussions for today and for tomorrow. The restrooms are located directly behind me and the opposite side of the hallway. Fire exits are clearly marked throughout the building, and should there be an emergency, I will invite you all to exit through the same doors in which you entered today, as opposed to the very pastoral scenes you will see behind you and some of the other doors. It looks like they are a fire exit, but they in fact are not. The only exit out of this room is the same way you came in, so we will ask you to move through those doors in the event of an emergency. As always, we ask that you do not use the elevators, and smoking is not permitted in the building. The program for the seminar is relatively tight, but you will note as you read the agenda we have identified breaks, and that will both for our refreshment spiritually and physically, and to allow for opportunities for informal discussions. These coffee breaks and lunch, both for today and tomorrow, will be held in the Salon Verrières, which is the same place we had the Icebreaker last night. For those of you who could not join us last night, the salon is on the first floor in the enclosed atrium area that you walk through on the way down. As a reminder, now would be a good time, ladies and gentlemen, to make sure that all your mobile communication devices, your cell phones and your iPads are switched off or on silent mode. May I also ask that you take your name tags that were on your chairs this morning and you put them underneath the chairs on the way to the coffee break. We will be gathering up those name tags later on this morning, and we'll need them for the breakout sessions in the afternoon. Our Delegate Assistance Center, which is that table that you walk past, is located just outside this room and will be manned through today and tomorrow. Should there be any other questions that you have, you do not need to go to the desk to get them answered. You can contact any member of the seminar support staff who can be identified by a yellow band on their name tags. Our seminar will begin with some opening remarks provided by the plenary, so if you'll give me just a moment while the official party gathers, I will then introduce them and we will begin the seminar. Please stay in your seats. And while we're waiting for the headsets, just as a reminder, Channel 1 will provide translation in French Channel 2 translation in English. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the arrival of the official party. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. It is now my pleasure to introduce Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, General Jean-Paul Palomeros.
Monsieur le Secrétaire Général,
Secretary General,
Monsieur le Ministre,
Minister,
Ambassadeurs,
Ambassadors,
Messieurs les officiers généraux, Mesdames, Messieurs,
flag officers, ladies and gentlemen.
je tiens d'abord à vous remercier
First of
pour
all, I
votre
want to
présence
thank you for coming
à ce séminaire de la
to this
transformation
transformation
de l'OTAN.
seminar.
Elle représente le meilleur témoignage de
Which
satisfaction
those who've worked so hard on it will find particularly
qui se
notable.
sont investis à Norfolk,
And I would like
à
to thank
Bruxelles
those who in Brussels, in Norfolk
pour
and
cet
in Paris
événement et que je remercie
prepared it
d'ores et
so
déjà.
well, and I thank them.
Faut-il souligner l'opportunité
Is it even
que
worth
représente
pointing
ce
out
forum dans la
the
perspective
great opportunity
du
we
sommet de
this
septembre,
transformation seminar
alors même que
offers
s'est développée une crise majeure aux frontières
while
orientales
a
de
crisis
l'Alliance,
develops at the eastern
à
edges of
l'heure
our
où se
alliance,
dessine une période de
at a time
transition
when we are at a
cruciale
crucial
en
time of
Afghanistan, et alors que plus que jamais,
transition in
nous
Afghanistan,
devons
and more than ever,
préparer
we have to
l'avenir de
prepare
l'Alliance.
NATO's future.
J'ai la conviction que les événements
I'm
actuels
convinced
ne
that
peuvent que nous inciter
current events
à
can
poursuivre résolument
only encourage us
la
further
transformation de
to
notre
continue with the
militaire,
transformation of our military
l'adaptation de nos
toolbox,
capacités,
continue to adapt our
l'amélioration de
capabilities,
l'interopérabilité
improve
et de
interoperability
notre réactivité,
and our ability
le
to react.
développement de nouvelles coopérations
Also develop new
multinationales
multinational
et la poursuite de
cooperation
partenariats
frameworks
constructifs.
and constructive
Il
partnerships.
y a 12 ans, à Prague,
12 years ago in
Lord
Prague,
Robertson qualifiait déjà
Lord
le sommet de
Robertson
l'OTAN
had already
de
called
sommet
that
de la
summit
transformation.
the Summit of
En
Transformation.
fait, toute transformation pour
But
être efficace
any
doit
transformation,
s'inscrire
if it is to
dans la
last,
durée et dans
must
la
take place
continuité,
over time
comme une solide
and must
ligne
be
de
a
vie
solid
qui garantira
lifeline
l'Alliance,
linking
le futur de l'Alliance à son
the
passé.
future of the alliance to its
Les
past.
2 dernières décennies ont été riches dans cette
Over the
veine.
last 2 decades, we have learned very much from our operations, and we must integrate these lessons into our future work, lest we run the risk of rediscovering them in the heat of the moment,
Des hommes et des femmes
and to do this at the
que nous
risk
engagerons demain dans les opérations.
for the men and women we
Dans notre
deploy
éprouvé
in operations.
capacitaire,
Amongst
les
our
moyens de
capabilities,
renseignement stratégique,
strategic intelligence
de
assets,
reconnaissance, de
those we
surveillance,
use for reconnaissance, surveillance, are not an option, but are absolutely necessary and will be required for any crisis management, operation, or decision-making.
de la protection de nos
The
forces
continued
et populations
improvement of our ability to protect our forces and our people,
confrontés
confronted with all types of threats, such as IEDs or ballistic missiles. This is a challenge, but it's more than that, it is a duty. To answer the vast range of missions which come out of our strategic concept, our forces must be agile, mobile, adaptable. They must be ready to intervene very quickly, and in particular, this applies to the NRF. And they must be perfectly trained. Their interoperability is the essential condition for the success of alliance operations, but also more and more the important contribution our partners can make and which allow us to endure our operations over the long term, as is the case now in Afghanistan. Success will require decisive force, but this force must be controlled, applied precisely. We must limit collateral damage, and these characteristics of an efficient adapted, reactive military tool summarize the lessons we have drawn over 20 years of operations by the Alliance and are already being fed into our prospective work being carried by the HQ. In 2014, as was the case in 2002, the Alliance's transformation has important stakes. It must ensure the military relevance of the future alliance, has to balance fundamental important factors like collective defense and crisis management, which I do not think are contradictory, but I believe will require more and more than ever mobile forces which can be sent far from home. And I believe that the Ukrainian crisis has reinforced this notion. And we must also draw lessons from new operations, new types of operations. It also reminds us that we must match our ambitions and the human and financial resources we are willing to use, and to ensure that the transatlantic link, which is the true lifeline of our alliance and has been for 65 years, must be preserved and supported. And finally, we must use the synergy offered by these two complementary organizations, which are NATO and the European Union. But to address all these challenges, we have no other option but to carry out and use all these tools: common planning, multinational projects, Connected Forces Initiative, partnerships, but also make use of the innovative possibilities offered by new technologies and new generations. And when I think about these young men and women who will build and inherit our alliance tomorrow, and it brings to mind a quote from a compatriot of mine, a pilot but also a poet, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote, "If you want to build a boat, you must instill in the hearts of man a longing for the sea." And I think Britain's, my defense minister, you will appreciate how important this is, and we are very attached to it in Norfolk. I'm sure that this seminar will help us keep the right heading despite the storms and challenges ahead, and I hope we will bring the alliance to port with a greater security. Ladies and gentlemen, to start us on the right way, it is for me a great honor and privilege to welcome here the Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and after him, the Minister of Defense of France, Jean-Yves Le Drian. Mr. Secretary General, I'm delighted to hand over to you.
Monsieur le Ministre Général,
Minister, Generals, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me first and foremost to thank the Minister Le Drian for France's generous hosting of this conference in Paris. This testifies yet again to France's very strong commitment to NATO, and it is an example which France is setting within our alliance. France has shown its solidarity by deploying additional aircraft to support our air policing mission in the Baltic states. France also brings a major contribution to Europe's security and to the alliance's security through its operations in Mali and in the Central African Republic. And France remains determined to invest in defense capabilities, high-tech capabilities, which we very much need both at NATO and the European Union. And of course, One of the most valuable contributions which France is making to the alliance is Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation, General Palomeros. I would like to thank him, as well as his team, for the extraordinary work which is being carried out to the benefit of smart defense, of the Connected Forces Initiative, and more widely, streaming to reform the alliance. I am also very grateful to him for having organized this seminar. Thank you very much.
We are meeting at a defining moment for the security architecture we have built together over the last decades. Events in eastern Ukraine are of great concern. I urge Russia to step back. Any further move into eastern Ukraine would represent a serious escalation rather than the de-escalation that we all seek. We call on Russia to pull back the tens of thousands of troops it has massed on Ukraine's borders. Engage in a genuine dialogue with the Ukrainian authorities and respects its international commitments. The crisis raises serious questions for Euro-Atlantic security. Now is the time for the right answers. And let me put forward 3 answers which I see as key for our Wales summit in September. We must prepare a readiness action plan. We must reinvest in our defense. And we must reinforce the transatlantic bond. So, first, we must stand ready at all times to safeguard the security of all allies, to deter and defend against any attack, to deal with the unexpected, and to address the Argo crisis around our borders with our network of partners around the world. Because from Sevastopol to Syria and the Sahel, we are facing a dangerous world where threats are complex, unpredictable, and interconnected. Newer challenges such as terrorism, failed states, cyber and missile attacks, and old challenges in new guises, such as attempts to redraw borders by force. We must develop an action plan to strengthen our readiness, and this requires the right training, the right posture, and the right capabilities. First, training and exercising. This is about our people and platforms being properly prepared, exercised together, trained together, and ready to be deployed together, wherever and whenever required. We must continue to build on our Connected Forces Initiative to exercise more frequently and with more forces. We must exercise all scenarios, including collective defense. We must rehearse reinforcement. This involves not just the dispatch and deployment of forces, but also ensuring they have what they need when they arrive. And we must exercise in the places where we may expect to deploy not just in military training areas, as allies and together with partners. The second element in a readiness action plan is the NATO response force. We have it, and we must use it. To do that, we should place parts of it at very high readiness. But this is not enough. We must review the readiness of all our forces to ensure that we can act within reduced warning times. Of course, you cannot react quickly if you are not in the right place. So we must also review where we place our forces, how we posture them, and how we redeploy them rapidly when necessary. And all this needs to be underpinned by the appropriate defense plans, prepared and ready to use. The third element for improved readiness is improved capabilities. We need to procure the high-end capabilities that we currently lack: joint intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, missile defense, air command and control, and airlift. Much work has already been done to fill these gaps, but we need to advance and expand our programs. Of course, readiness has a cost. But if we are not ready for whatever the future brings, we place our security at risk. And the costs of insecurity are much higher. And this leads me to my second point. This crisis has shown that we cannot take our security for granted. So we must be ready to pay the price to preserve it. Over the past years, some of our European allies have cut their defense spending by as much as 40%, while other countries, like Russia, are increasing theirs by 30%. The reality is that Europeans have disarmed too much and for too long. In NATO, we have agreed a defense spending guideline of 2% of gross domestic product. Too few allies meet this guideline, and too many have moved too far in the other direction. This is the time to stop the cuts and start reversing the trend. I'm not naive. I know defense spending will not increase overnight. But we cannot have effective collective security without collective commitment. This is not just about what we invest, but also about how we invest. So we must prioritize so we can acquire what we need for the future and replace what was needed in the past. We must also do more to seek multinational solutions. Through our Smart Defense initiative, allies are already achieving savings, and they are acquiring capabilities. We must maintain this momentum. My third and final point is that the bond between North America and Europe remains vital for our shared security, and we must reinforce it. Our transatlantic community is built on common values and a common vision of Europe whole, free, and at peace. It is now at the center of a wide network of global partnerships, not just for the security, but also for the economy and trade. And it plays a vital role in setting and upholding global norms. The current crisis poses a serious challenge to our common security. But North America and Europe stand together in facing up to it. And we stand united in our firm response. In recent weeks, we have seen the United States' clear commitment to European security, from the Baltics to the Black Sea. France and other European allies are complementing that effort. And the European Council in December showed that European nations are prepared to step up. So I encourage all allies to play their full part. This is the time to find a better balance of costs and responsibilities between allies, both between the United States and Europe and among allies within Europe. A better transatlantic balance is also based on better cooperation between NATO and the European Union. We are working together successfully in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, and in the Indian Ocean. And when I look to Ukraine, I see scope for an even closer relationship. We all have an interest in helping to stabilize and strengthen Ukraine. There is a lot of work to do, and there is a role for all of us to play. The European Union could make a considerable contribution in helping to reform the police and border service, while NATO could help to reform the Ukrainian defense structures and armed forces, as the Ukrainian authorities have asked us to do. Such a close and coordinated cooperation between NATO and the European Union would be good for Ukraine, and it would also be good for Europe and North America. Our strength is our solidarity. We are simply stronger when we act together. This does not contradict national sovereignty. It reinforces it. That is why I have asked 3 groups of experts from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, prominent think tanks, and young leaders to make recommendations on how we can strengthen the transatlantic bond. Their reports are due in June, and I'm very pleased to see that so many of these excellent experts are taking part in this seminar. Ladies and gentlemen, the current crisis has highlighted some important lessons for our alliance. We need to improve our collective defense and readiness. We have to increase our investment in defense, and we must maintain the vitality of our transatlantic bond. For the past 11 years, Allied Command Transformation has demonstrated its value and success as a driver for change. And as we approach our summit in Wales later this year, your debates should help us find the way to apply those lessons. So I look forward to receiving your recommendations so that NATO remains ready and robust in an unpredictable world. Thank you very much. And now, General Palomeros has asked me to hand over to Defense Minister Le Drian. Monsieur le Ministre, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi de vous donner la parole.
Minister, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Secrétaire Général,
Secretary General,
Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs
ambassadors,
les généraux, Mesdames et Messieurs,
flag officers, ladies and
je
gentlemen.
suis très heureux que la France accueille
I'm very pleased that France is hosting
Nord et au comité militaire
the ambassadors to the North Atlantic Council and the military representatives to NATO.
du sommet de l'OTAN.
The seminar comes as it does in the run-up to the summit
L'excellente idée de
in South Wales.
personnalité
General, Secretary General, you had the excellent idea of inviting a number of distinguished experts
du monde public
of varying backgrounds from both the public and private sector.
concours au commandement
And these
allié
experts
pour
will make their
France
contributions
a l'honneur de diriger à travers le général
for the seminar
Palomeros, que je salue avec beaucoup d'amitié.
organized by the Allied Command Transformation, led by General Palomeros,
de l'Alliance et
France,
de lui permettre
in order to
de
reflect on the transformation of the alliance to help it meet ever-changing threats in a world which has never been so unstable.
des deux côtés de l'Atlantique.
As each day passes on both sides of the Atlantic, the Allied Command Transformation analyzes a number of industrial, technological, and operational factors while taking into account the priorities of member nations in order to allow us to find ways to react to situations with national assets that are increasingly interoperable. Ladies and gentlemen, the context in which we are meeting today is undoubtedly that of a very unique crisis. And the Euro-Atlantic environment is certainly more unstable than it was at the Chicago and Lisbon summits. In addition to turbulence in the Middle East and in the Sahel, we have a crisis which re-emerged on the eastern borders of the alliance. One of the alliance's partners, Ukraine, protected by an international agreement signed by its major neighbors and protected by the commitments made by members of the UN Security Council, has lost a portion of its national territory as a result of the illegitimate use of military force by Russia. The Ukrainian crisis is very serious, and it goes beyond the scope of NATO. It indeed calls into question the very basic principles of stability in Europe since the end of the Cold War and the end of the Second World War. Our principal means of action vis-à-vis Russia are political and economic, and they are implemented by international organizations, primarily the UN and the EU. And they have also done work in settings such as the G7. However, NATO remains a vital actor in managing these crises, because NATO plays a fundamental role in Europe's security and benefits from great credibility in terms of in political and military terms. NATO, in reacting to the crisis in Ukraine, will have to make itself even stronger for tomorrow. The decisions made by our heads of state and government, as well as your work day to day, provide us with a solid basis of support. And we recall the essential principles which are at the heart of our work. NATO must be able to deal with any strategic surprise by developing the right capabilities through national choices and through a group effort in order to develop an appropriate architecture. And in that undertaking, France, which has undertaken great efforts for its national defense system, will play its full role. And in this debate on the transformation of the alliance, I would like to answer three questions in these remarks, since I have been granted the honor of making an opening speech at this seminar. The first question is NATO ready for the crises that we are currently facing? I refer to all of these crises, and in particular to the Ukrainian crisis. NATO will be stronger if it is united in reaffirming the purpose of its three principal missions. These missions are enshrined in the strategic concept adopted at the Lisbon Summit, and I think that these three principles are mutually reinforcing: crisis management, collective defense, and cooperative security. The most recent crises confirm that these three fundamental missions remain valid. And General, you recalled this earlier. These three missions are ever closer linked. It would be artificial to draw distinctions or oppositions between collective defense and the two other missions. For example, in crisis management, our success in protecting civilian populations is only possible because we have military assets and capabilities that were originally designed for collective defense. For example, the use of the French Rafale aircraft in Libya in March 2011 would not have been possible if we hadn't had this modern capability. And this capability was, in fact, originally designed during the Cold War. It was, at its heart, part of the aerial component of France's nuclear arsenal, part of collective defense, therefore. And more recently, in January 2013, our fighter jets carried out strikes simultaneously on 21 sites scattered across northern Mali. Those aircraft left from bases in France. And that is why a joint ISR, for example, is very important in allowing us to meet these very significant challenges. For example, the tanker aircraft and the NATO AWACS aircraft, which the AWACS aircraft, which are currently flying over Poland and Romania, are the same aircraft which can be used perhaps in the future in responding to crises. And with the end of the ISAF mission at the end of 2014, NATO is preparing to close a 20-year chapter of operations. The operational experience and the lessons learned from Afghanistan, the increasing interoperability of our forces, the sharing of tasks with our partners are a major asset and should be maintained. That solidarity, as expressed during 20 years, must be maintained even in the absence of operations. Afghanistan, as well as other NATO operations and missions over the past years, have again shown the importance of cooperative security. Many partners in the EU, Sweden, partners in the Asia-Pacific region, in the Middle East, have been part of these missions, showing that cooperative security is very important. So therefore, these three fundamental missions, again, are closely intertwined and serve as the basis for our reflection. Some may claim that collective defense is more important than the two other missions, and they may advance that. If you look at, for example, the debate in French Parliament and in French public opinion recently, I wanted to make sure that France was able to maintain its full range of military capabilities in facing any type of military commitment. We needed to make sure that the full spectrum of our capabilities was maintained in order to react to any type of circumstance. Collective defense remained at the heart and remains at the heart of the alliance's decisions and actions. Our defense posture and the deterrence posture, as adopted at the Chicago summit, requires us to maintain an appropriate balance between conventional components, nuclear forces, and anti-missile defense. The importance of that appropriate balance, I think, is confirmed by current events. And the current circumstances show us that the reassurance granted to our citizens by heads of state and government is very important, since they affirm that as long as there are nuclear weapons in the world, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. Turkey, in facing the Syrian crisis, defended its sovereignty and used its military forces wisely. Several allies deployed anti-missile defense systems to Turkey with the agreement of the North Atlantic Council. And that council agreement requires us to act collectively, therefore showing that collective defense remains the essential component of the alliance, notably when it comes to protecting sovereignty, the sovereignty of each and every member of our alliance. Allow me now to move on to my second question. How can we provide ourselves with the right means and assets for fulfilling missions credibly? I'd like to answer that question very frankly. There are three basic principles, essential principles which must be respected: solidarity, responsibility, and credibility. Firstly, solidarity. The notion itself is not new. I mentioned it at the end of the first part of my remarks. It is a solidarity which lies at the heart of the Washington Treaty, and it is on the basis of that principle that, for example, France's contributions were decided to steadfast jazz, a major NATO exercise in the Baltic countries and Poland. It is also on the basis of the principle of solidarity that France's President, François Hollande, wanted to demonstrate France's willingness to act in these times of crisis. And as you pointed out, Secretary General, and as I pointed out during my recent visit to Poland and the Baltic states, it is that principle of solidarity which allows France and NATO to strengthen its assets for the air policing mission over the airspace of Baltic countries, as well as over the airspace of Poland and Romania. These decisions, taken in various capitals, demonstrate the strength of the message that we are carrying, namely the credibility of the alliance. Article 5 is not simply a commitment of American allies to Europeans, but rather it is a commitment voiced by 28 allies, for all 28 allies. Solidarity can also be expressed on a bilateral level. At my speech at Hiver at an interministerial meeting in 2012 regarding cyber defense, I stated that NATO should focus on the protection of its own networks, and that every country needs to step up and accept its responsibilities at the national level in order to benefit from effective bilateral support when needed in times of crisis. Estonia, I think, has shown the way forward, and its national efforts are what allow France to develop a number of bilateral programs through the Center of Excellence in Tallinn, which can then benefit the entire alliance. I'd like to move on now to the principle of responsibility. Expressing solidarity requires us also to respect a second principle, namely responsibility, by strengthening our capabilities. Responsibility means allowing countries to freely choose their capabilities, taking into account national industrial return, and also being able to deploy capabilities and operations. We must work collectively through the NATO capacity development process. In 2010 at Lisbon, the Allies reformed that capacity development process, and the new approach has a number of advantages. It allows the 28 NATO allies to work together by respecting national sovereignty, working together as a coherent whole, and those efforts allow General Jean-Paul Palomeros and his teams to present a number of capacity options, clear capacity options in June, identifying capability shortfalls attached with the associated risks over the coming years. The share of GDP spent on defense and this goal of 2% defense spending is set at the head of state and head of government level. But we can go further than that objective by looking at what percentage of spending is spent on major equipment acquisitions and on research. 20% of our defense spending goes to those two fields. We do see great differences between Europeans in this matter. Defense spending in terms of major investments and research and development is above 20% for some European allies, but far below that for other allies. Therefore, reform is important. Alliance needs to improve its investments in capacity development. And conversely, we must avoid the temptation of automatically falling back on common funded projects because the budgetary efforts must be shared equally between allies, and we know what the discrepancies are between European allies, and therefore that solution would not be the most appropriate. And the third principle that I would like to mention is credibility. Solidarity and responsibility are essentially what provide backbone to the idea of credibility. And this credibility stems from capabilities that can be used. But credibility also depends on the political will necessary to take action. That political will, in turn, depends on having a shared analysis and shared view of our geostrategic environment. Firstly, the unrest and the geopolitical challenges at Europe's borders are relevant to all of us since these situations will not somehow stop at Europe's southern or eastern borders. The tensions and conflicts in this region are not strictly defense-related. There are demographic challenges, economic challenges, and it is for those reasons that we must continue to enhance our capabilities and our assets, both within NATO and beyond, in order to make sure that our alliance is sovereign and that it benefits from strong political will. The combat and transport helicopters used in Mali and a number of assets used by the Netherlands under the flag of the UN show that there is strong moral and material commitment to these issues, and that can take place outside of NATO because it is important to note that we follow different standards and procedures within NATO. And it is in those operations as well that allies show that their will to act. It is through those operations that we can also develop interoperability, which is more important than ever for the success of military operations. And finally, my third and last question: what should our vision be of the alliance? It is an essential question. We must think about it. We must develop answers to it before the summit in Wales, as you sketched out, Secretary General. NATO's future must be rooted in ideas, principles, and renewed political will. It is on that basis that our adversaries will judge us and will measure us. So the three principles that I mentioned, responsibility, credibility, solidarity, are important. However, the transatlantic bond will be nothing without the will to allocate the sufficient resources, as you also pointed out, Secretary General. Our open door policy, openness to others, cooperative security, and these exist both to project stability and to serve our own security interests. And that leads me, at least on a preliminary basis, to identify three areas of interest before the summit. Firstly, the alliance can focus on its areas of excellence with a particular focus on collective defense. NATO is a political and military alliance. We must maintain credible forces that can fulfill missions in terms of collective defense, crisis management, and collective security. And that requires us to be able to respond to a number of challenges. The challenges in terms of preparation for high-intensity conflicts, and challenges in terms of prioritizing our different needs, challenges in terms of interoperability and standardization, which is essential for the alliance's credibility and effectiveness. I think that's the first area for the summit. Second area that must be kept in mind for the summit is strengthening our ties to other international organizations. The mutually reinforcing nature of the UN, the EU, and NATO has been proven once again by the Ukrainian crisis. I note that in times of crisis, emergency meetings in joint format between NATO and the EU demonstrate the strong ties that do exist between these two institutions. And Secretary General, you mentioned that earlier. You are also well aware of the fact that for France it is very important to have flexible arrangements in crisis response, and the fact that we must avoid any unnecessary duplication and waste of resources between these two organizations. And that raises a number of other challenges. We have to optimize these different frameworks of engagement, notably for exercises. For example, the flagship exercise in 2015 for NATO, why not associate that with the European Union, as we could also, along similar lines as the Franco-German Expeditionary Corps. We could also focus on pooling and sharing capabilities. That pooling of capabilities is a major underlying theme of the French White Paper on Defense, and that also lies at the heart of joint ISR, the real-time ISR, the real-time sharing of information. That's something we must continue to strengthen, and our exercise Unified Vision, which is scheduled shortly in Norway, will help us to strengthen that capability. Perhaps we could have an interim declaration of JSR capability after that exercise. We also face a number of industrial challenges. Among the countries who spend at least 20% of their defense budgets on the acquisition of major systems and on research and development, among those countries, I see that most of those countries do have a strong military-industrial base. But if Europeans really are to share the capability burden, we must think about the future of the defense industry in Europe, and we must think about how we can ensure its future over the long term. The third idea that we can think about in terms of the summit also is strengthen our work with partners. There are a number of challenges that we can meet with partners who wish to work with us. There are aspects, for example, of the Smart Defense Program, exercises, the Connected Forces Initiative. These are all examples of what we can offer partners. Therefore, I think we must work to strengthen those ties with partners, especially with a view to enhancing interoperability. It is interoperability which is essential for allowing members of the alliance and partners to work together effectively in defense as well as in security sector reform. Ladies and gentlemen, I should like to conclude by saying quite simply that the Alliance must continue efforts undertaken since the last summit to modernize in order to meet its basic and fundamental principles, which are of the utmost importance for our security and for those who share our values. Secretary General, during the course of your term, marked by NATO's unprecedented commitment to operations, I think your actions have expressed NATO's underlying vision, and I should like to thank you quite sincerely for that. With a renewed commitment to reform, improved interoperability between allies and with partners, strengthened political will to take action at 28, the North Atlantic Alliance will remain an alliance of countries that express solidarity. It is a credible alliance. It's based on individual approaches, which are modest but honest and coordinated together towards common goals. And I think that those ideas will be at the heart of the seminar. And in the run-up to the Newport Summit, this debate is indeed very needed, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here in Paris. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the departure of the official party. Please be seated. So, ambassadors, generals, admirals, and honored guests, thank you for joining us again. Your participation is what will make this seminar the success. So we have been well set up with the comments of the opening statements, and now as the rest of the days continue, we will be most interested in your opinions and your thoughts on the progress for the alliance, which we will capture in a report and send out to you. So giving ourselves the opportunity to demonstrate the flexibility of the alliance, we're going to have a slight change to the agenda. We'll take the coffee break now, and then, ladies and gentlemen, we'll ask that you be back here to start the first plenary session at 10:45.